Sarah Martinez had learned long ago that silence could be her greatest weapon. Standing in the corner of the crowded mess hall at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she watched the controlled chaos of dinner service unfold before her. Soldiers moved between tables carrying trays of steaming food, their conversations mixing into a low hum that filled the concrete building. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces, each person carrying the weight of another day in hostile territory. She had deliberately chosen this spot near the back wall, away from the main flow of traffic. It was not because she was antisocial, but because years of training had taught her to always maintain situational awareness. From here, she could see every entrance and exit, every potential threat or escape route. Her gray eyes swept across the room methodically, cataloging faces and noting anything unusual. Most of the soldiers in the mess hall wore the standard Army combat uniform, their name tapes clearly visible on their chests. Sarah wore similar clothing, but hers bore no identifying marks that would reveal her true role. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be just another support staff member grabbing a quick meal. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her slight frame made her blend easily into the background. This anonymity was intentional and carefully maintained. The base had been her temporary home for 3 weeks now, part of a classified operation that officially did not exist. While the regular Army units conducted their visible missions, Sarah and her team worked in the shadows, gathering intelligence and preparing for operations that would never appear in any official reports. It was the nature of special operations to remain invisible, and Sarah had perfected the art of being unremarkable. She picked at her meal without much enthusiasm, more focused on observing than eating. The food was typical military fare, filling but hardly appetizing. Around her, conversations flowed in multiple languages as international coalition forces shared the same dining space. She could hear fragments of English, Arabic, and what sounded like German from a table of European advisors. Her radio crackled softly in her ear, a routine check from her team leader. She responded with a quiet click of her transmit button, indicating all was well. In 2 hours, she would brief the base commander on intelligence gathered during last night's reconnaissance mission. Until then, she had chosen to grab a meal and observe the daily rhythms of the base. The mess hall served as more than just a place to eat. It was the social center of the base, where rumors spread faster than wildfire and tensions sometimes boiled over. Sarah had seen fights break out over card games, heated arguments about politics, and the occasional confrontation between different units. Military life, especially in combat zones, created a pressure cooker environment where small irritations could explode into major incidents. As she sat quietly, Sarah noticed 4 men at a table near the center of the room. They were not part of the regular base population. Their uniforms were clean, suggesting they had recently arrived, and their body language indicated they were not comfortable in this environment. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing around the room with the suspicious awareness of people who felt out of place. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped blonde hair, seemed to be the leader of the group. He wore the insignia of a Marine sergeant, but something about his demeanor struck Sarah as odd. Real Marines who had earned their rank carried themselves with a particular confidence born of rigorous training and combat experience. This man had the physical appearance of a warrior, but lacked the subtle signs of genuine military bearing. Sarah continued to observe while maintaining her cover of disinterested eating. The 4 men finished their meal and began moving toward the exit. As they passed near her table, she overheard a fragment of their conversation that made her blood run cold. "The target should be in Building 7 tonight," the blond man said quietly to his companions. "Security will be minimal during the shift change." Building 7 housed the base communications center, where sensitive intelligence was processed and transmitted to higher command levels. Any unauthorized access to that facility could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. Sarah felt her training kick in as she processed this information. These men were not what they appeared to be. She waited until they had left the mess hall before activating her radio. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, she contacted her team leader. "Ghost 1, this is Ghost 3. I have a potential security situation developing. Request immediate contact." The response came back within seconds. "Ghost 3, we copy. What is your status?" Sarah quickly relayed what she had observed and overheard. Her team leader instructed her to maintain visual contact with the suspects while backup was arranged. She acknowledged the order and began moving toward the exit, her mind already shifting into operational mode. Outside the mess hall, the Afghan evening was settling in with the rapid transition from day to night that characterized the region. The temperature was dropping quickly, and most personnel were heading indoors for the night. Sarah spotted the 4 men walking toward the perimeter of the base, moving with purpose but trying to appear casual. She followed at a distance, using her training in surveillance to remain invisible. The men stopped at a supply building and appeared to be waiting for something. Sarah positioned herself behind a concrete barrier where she could observe their activities without being detected. Her radio crackled again. "Ghost 3. We are experiencing delays with backup. Maintain position and report any significant developments." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while keeping her eyes fixed on the targets. She understood that in special operations, backup was not always available when needed. Sometimes operators had to make critical decisions based on incomplete information and limited resources. The 4 men began moving again, this time heading directly toward Building 7. Sarah realized that whatever they were planning was happening now, not later as she had initially thought. The shift change her target had mentioned was occurring right at this moment, creating a window of vulnerability that these infiltrators intended to exploit. She had a choice to make. She could continue to observe and report, hoping that backup would arrive in time to prevent whatever these men were planning. Or she could act on her own, using her training and skills to neutralize the threat before it could materialize. Both options carried significant risks, but only one guaranteed the protection of critical base assets and personnel. Sarah checked her sidearm and confirmed her equipment was secure. Years of training had prepared her for moments exactly like this one. She thought about her teammates who depended on the intelligence processed in Building 7, about the soldiers sleeping peacefully in their quarters who had no idea that their security was about to be compromised. The decision was made in that instant. She would not allow these infiltrators to complete their mission, regardless of the personal risk involved. Sarah Martinez had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and that oath meant more to her than her own safety. She began moving toward Building 7, staying in the shadows and using her knowledge of the base layout to approach from an unexpected angle. The 4 men were so focused on their target that they failed to notice the silent figure tracking their movements through the darkness. As she closed the distance, Sarah could see that the men were carrying equipment that confirmed her worst suspicions. They had breaching charges and electronic devices that could only be used for one purpose. These were not random troublemakers or soldiers settling a personal dispute. They were trained operatives conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation against American forces. The blonde leader was positioning his team for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the communications facility. Sarah realized she had perhaps 2 minutes before they would begin their attack. 2 minutes to prevent a security breach that could have consequences far beyond this single base. She activated her radio one final time. "Ghost 1, I am engaging. Targets are hostile infiltrators preparing to breach Building 7. Send backup to my location immediately." Sarah did not wait for a response. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Every step calculated and silent. The years of brutal training, the countless hours of preparation, and the unwavering dedication to her mission all crystallized into this single moment of action. The four men moved with calculated precision toward Building 7, unaware that death itself was stalking them through the shadows. Sarah Martinez had closed the distance to 20 meters, close enough to hear their whispered communications as they prepared to breach the communications center. The leader raised his hand, signaling his team to take their positions around the building's single entrance. Sarah knew she had one opportunity to prevent this catastrophe. 4 against 1 were impossible odds in a conventional engagement, but she had never been trained for conventional warfare. Navy SEAL training had taught her that the most effective weapon was not the one in her hands, but the one between her ears. Superior tactics, precise timing, and absolute commitment could overcome any numerical disadvantage. She studied their positioning and identified the critical flaw in their formation. The 4 men were focused entirely on their target, creating a tunnel vision that made them vulnerable to attack from their flanks. The leader was directing operations from the rear, while his 3 subordinates prepared their breaching equipment. If she could neutralize him quickly and silently, the remaining 3 would lose their coordination and command structure. Sarah moved with the deadly grace that had been drilled into her through years of training. Every step was placed with surgical precision, avoiding loose gravel or debris that might create noise. Her breathing was controlled and silent, her heart rate steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was what she had been trained for, what she had dedicated her life to achieving. The distance closed to 15 meters, then 10. She could see the individual features of her targets now, could hear their breathing, and the soft clicks of their equipment being prepared. The blonde leader was studying a handheld device that appeared to be some sort of electronic scanner, probably designed to defeat the building's security systems. At 5 meters, Sarah was close enough to strike. She drew her combat knife in a motion so fluid it seemed like liquid mercury, the blade catching no light as it emerged from its sheath. Her target remained focused on his device, completely unaware that his life was about to end. Sarah moved like a ghost made flesh. Her left hand clamped over the leader's mouth, while her right hand drove the knife between his ribs with surgical precision, angling upward to pierce his heart. He died without making a sound, his body going limp in her arms. She lowered him gently to the ground, already moving toward her next target. The second man was positioned at the corner of the building, watching for security patrols that would never come during the shift change. Sarah approached from his blind side, moving through shadows that seemed to bend around her. Her knife found his throat before he could turn around, opening his carotid artery with a single, efficient cut. He collapsed silently, his weapon clattering softly against the concrete. 2 down, 2 to go. But the remaining infiltrators had heard something. They turned from their positions at the building's entrance, scanning the darkness for threats they could not see. Sarah had lost the element of complete surprise, but she retained the advantage of superior training and battlefield awareness. "Marcus? Thompson? Report," one of the remaining men called out in a harsh whisper. He was holding an assault rifle and moving toward the location where his teammates had disappeared into the shadows. His companion maintained position at the door, but was clearly nervous, swinging his weapon back and forth across potential approach routes. Sarah had positioned herself behind a concrete utility structure, invisible in the deeper shadows it created. She watched the armed man approach the bodies of his fallen comrades, saw the exact moment when he discovered their fate. His sharp intake of breath was followed by a curse as he raised his weapon and began sweeping the area with increased urgency. "We have a problem," he called back to his partner. "They are both dead. We have enemy contact." The man at the door abandoned his position and moved to join his surviving teammate. This was the mistake Sarah had been waiting for. They were now grouped together, making them easier to engage simultaneously. But they were also alert and armed, eliminating the possibility of another silent approach. Sarah made her decision in a fraction of a second. She emerged from cover like a shadow gaining substance, her sidearm drawn and ready. The two infiltrators saw her movement and began to swing their weapons toward her position, but they were a heartbeat too slow. Her first shot took the nearest man's center mass, a double tap to the chest that dropped him instantly. The second man managed to bring his rifle to bear, but Sarah was already moving, using the cover of concrete barriers and equipment to break his line of sight. His shots rang out in the night air, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. The base alarm system activated immediately, triggered by the sound of gunfire. Floodlights snapped on across the compound, and Sarah could hear the sound of running boots as security teams responded to the emergency. But the remaining infiltrator was still active and dangerous, and she could not wait for backup to arrive. She flanked him using a route that took her behind a row of generators, their mechanical noise masking her approach. The man was focused on the area where he had last seen her, his rifle trained on shadows that no longer contained any threat. Sarah emerged from his blind side and engaged him at close range. The fight was brief, but vicious. He was larger and stronger than Sarah, but she possessed advantages that raw physical power could not overcome. Years of hand-to-hand combat training had taught her how to use an opponent's strength against them, how to turn size into a liability rather than an asset. She deflected his rifle barrel with a precise strike to his wrists, causing his shots to go wide. Before he could recover, she drove her knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over and creating an opening for a devastating elbow strike to the back of his neck. He went down hard, his weapon skittering away across the concrete. Sarah secured his rifle and quickly checked his pulse. He was unconscious, but alive, which meant he could potentially provide intelligence about who had sent them and what other operations might be planned. She zip-tied his hands behind his back using restraints from her tactical gear, then activated her radio to report the situation. Ghost 1, this is Ghost 3. 4 infiltrators neutralized. 3 KIA, 1 prisoner secured. Building 7 is secure, but I need immediate backup for prisoner processing and site cleanup. The response came back immediately. Outstanding work, Ghost 3. Security teams are en route to your location. Medical and intelligence personnel are also responding. Sarah remained alert as she waited for backup to arrive. The immediate threat was neutralized, but she could not rule out the possibility of additional hostiles in the area. She positioned herself where she could observe all approaches to Building 7, while maintaining control over her prisoner. Within minutes, the area was swarming with security personnel. The base commander himself arrived to assess the situation, followed by intelligence officers who would begin the process of determining how these infiltrators had penetrated base security and what their ultimate objectives had been. As Sarah briefed the arriving personnel on what had occurred, she maintained the same quiet professionalism that had carried her through the engagement. She reported the facts without embellishment, describing her actions in the clinical terms that military personnel used to discuss violence and death. But inside, she felt the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that followed combat operations. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind the hollow feeling that came after taking human lives, even when those lives belonged to enemies who would have killed innocent people without hesitation. The base commander, Colonel Martinez, studied Sarah with new respect as she completed her briefing. He had been informed of her presence on the base, but had not been told the specific nature of her mission. Now he understood why Special Operations Command had placed such a valuable asset at his facility. "Outstanding work, Petty Officer Martinez," he said formally. "Your actions tonight prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach. The intelligence these infiltrators might have obtained could have compromised ongoing operations across the entire region." Sarah acknowledged the praise with a simple nod. She was already thinking about the next phase of the operation, the intelligence gathering that would determine whether this attack was an isolated incident or part of a larger enemy operation. Her work tonight was finished, but her mission was far from over. The interrogation room was stark and windowless, lit by a single fluorescent bulb that cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls. Sarah Martinez sat across from the surviving infiltrator, studying his face as intelligence officers prepared their equipment. The man had regained consciousness an hour earlier, and his initial defiance was already beginning to crack under the weight of his situation. His identification documents claimed he was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, United States Army, but Sarah knew those papers were sophisticated forgeries. Real soldiers did not carry the type of equipment these men had been using, nor did they possess the specific knowledge of base security rotations that had almost made their operation successful. "You know," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. "Your team made one critical mistake tonight." Torres looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. He had seen what remained of his teammates after Sarah had finished with them. Professional soldiers understood the difference between luck and skill, and what had happened to his team was definitely not luck. "What mistake was that?" he asked, his accent revealing traces of an origin that was definitely not American. Sarah leaned back in her metal chair, her posture relaxed but alert. "You assumed that everyone in that mess hall was exactly what they appeared to be. You saw a small woman eating alone and categorized her as a non-threat. That assumption cost you everything." The intelligence officer, Major Stevens, activated a digital recorder and placed several photographs on the table between Sarah and the prisoner. The images showed the infiltration route the team had used to access the base, along with equipment caches they had hidden in preparation for their mission. "We know you did not work alone," Stevens said. "This operation required extensive planning and intelligence gathering. Someone provided you with detailed information about base security procedures and personnel rotations. We need to know who that someone is." Torres remained silent, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to determine what information he could trade for leniency and what secrets he needed to protect at all costs. It was a familiar dance that played out in interrogation rooms around the world. Sarah stood and walked to the corner of the room where she could observe both the prisoner and the door. Her movement was casual, but Torres tracked her with the wary attention of prey watching a predator. He had experienced her capabilities firsthand and would not underestimate her again. "The interesting thing about tonight," Sarah continued, "is that your team knew exactly when the shift change would occur at Building 7. That information is not widely distributed, even among base personnel. It suggests you had access to someone with intimate knowledge of our operations." Major Stevens spread additional photographs across the table, these showing the 4 infiltrators during their reconnaissance activities over the previous week. Base security cameras had captured images of them in civilian clothing, conducting surveillance from positions outside the perimeter fence. "We have been watching you longer than you realize," Stevens explained. "Our counterintelligence teams identified your surveillance activities 3 days ago. We allowed you to continue because we wanted to understand the scope of your operation and identify your local support network." This revelation clearly surprised Torres, who had believed his team had operated without detection. Sarah saw the moment when he realized that their mission had been compromised from the beginning, that they had been walking into a carefully prepared trap. "The question now," Sarah said, "is whether you are going to help us identify the rest of your network, or whether you prefer to face trial for attempted sabotage, espionage, and terrorism. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the penalties for those charges can be quite severe." Torres looked between Sarah and Major Stevens, understanding that his situation was hopeless. He had been trained to resist interrogation, but he was also a pragmatist who could recognize when continued resistance would serve no useful purpose. "I want guarantees," he said finally. "Protection for my family and relocation assistance in exchange for full cooperation." Stevens nodded slowly. "That can be arranged, depending on the value of the information you provide. but understand that any deception or incomplete disclosure will void any agreement we reach." Over the next 6 hours, Torres provided a detailed account of his mission and the organization that had recruited him. He revealed the existence of a sophisticated intelligence network that had been operating in the region for months, gathering information on coalition forces and planning multiple attacks against critical infrastructure. The most disturbing revelation was that Torres and his team were part of a larger operation planned for the same night. While they attacked Building 7, other teams were supposed to strike targets at 3 different bases across the province. Their failure would alert security forces and potentially compromise the other operations. But some attacks might still proceed. Sarah listened to the interrogation while simultaneously coordinating with her team leader to pass critical intelligence to other bases in the region. Time was running short, and lives hung in the balance as security forces raced to prevent additional attacks. The prisoner also revealed the identity of his primary contact, a civilian contractor who had legitimate access to multiple coalition facilities. This individual had been collecting intelligence and passing it to hostile forces for several months, using his position to map security procedures and identify vulnerable targets. "Where is this contractor now?" Sarah asked. Torres hesitated before answering. "He was supposed to extract tonight after our mission was completed. He should be at the airfield, preparing to leave the country on a cargo flight scheduled for dawn." Sarah checked her watch. Dawn was still 4 hours away, which meant there was time to intercept the traitor before he could escape. She stood and headed for the door, already formulating a plan to capture this individual before he could disappear forever. "Where are you going?" Stevens asked. "To finish what we started," Sarah replied. "This contractor has information about the other planned attacks. If we can take him alive, we might be able to prevent a significant loss of life." Stevens nodded his understanding. "You will have full support for this operation, whatever resources you need." Sarah contacted her team leader and requested immediate extraction from the base. A helicopter was already being prepared for departure, and her teammates were loading equipment for what promised to be a complex capture operation at the airfield. As she prepared to leave the interrogation room, Torres called out to her. "You should know," he said, "that your reputation preceded you tonight. We were told to expect standard base security, not someone with your particular skills." Sarah paused at the door. "Who told you about me?" "The contractor. He said there were special operations personnel on the base, but that they would not be involved in routine security matters. He was wrong about that." This information confirmed what Sarah had suspected. The traitor had detailed knowledge of her team's presence and mission, which meant he had access to highly classified information. Capturing him was now more critical than ever, not just to prevent future attacks, but to determine the full extent of his intelligence-gathering activities. Sarah left the interrogation room and headed for the helicopter landing pad where her team was waiting. The night was far from over, and the most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. But she had proven tonight that sometimes the most unassuming person in the room could also be the most dangerous. As the helicopter lifted off into the darkness, carrying her toward the next phase of the operation, Sarah reflected on the events that had brought her to this moment. Years of training, sacrifice, and dedication had prepared her for nights like this one. She was a weapon forged in the crucible of the world's most elite military training, and tonight she had proven worthy of that forging. The mess hall where this all began was now quiet and empty, but the ripples of what had occurred there would continue to spread across the intelligence networks of both friendly and hostile forces. Word would spread that the quiet woman in the corner had been far more than she appeared, and perhaps future enemies would think twice before assuming that anyone on an American military base was truly defenseless. Sarah Martinez had done her job with the deadly professionalism that defined Navy SEAL operations. She had protected her fellow service members, prevented a significant security breach, and gathered intelligence that would save countless lives. It was all in a night's work for someone who had dedicated her life to standing guard in the shadows, ensuring that others could sleep safely in their beds.